noise and perhaps the sound, and you can see my dog in the background, as I've explained in previous videos. I'm actually on holiday at the moment in the Peak District in England, but as I also said, I'm going to continue to give you brief, regular updates about the situation as I understand it. Firstly, we've had further news of more advances by the Russian army in Donbass. As I discussed yesterday, the important town of Svyatogorsk has now been captured by the Russians. The earlier claims by the Ukrainians to have recovered ground in Severodonetsk have turned out to be not just untrue, but they're provoking a great deal of recriminations amongst Ukrainian commentators. There's now increasing criticism of President Zelensky and of his governor in Lugansk, Sergei Gadai, for actually making these claims. And there's now mounting criticism of the practice by the Ukrainians of trying to hold every inch of territory in Donbass, sacrificing large numbers of soldiers in, frankly, what are hopeless battles. And I'm going to come back to also the comment that I have made in the past, which is that the Russian strategy in Ukraine throughout has not been so much to capture cities or towns or particular territories. It has been to defeat and destroy the Ukrainian army as an organized force. That is very much consistent with Russian philosophy, war philosophies, and in fact it is exactly what the Russians are doing. And this Ukrainian practice of defending every inch of territory is actually working to the advantage of the Russians. It helps them to carry through with this strategy of basically defeating and destroying the Ukrainian army as an organized force. This is in contrast to what the United States did or does in other wars, in Iraq, for example, in 2003, where the United States made a beeline for Baghdad, captured Baghdad, but the Iraqi army was not defeated in battle. It still existed. The soldiers dispersed to their towns, still armed in most cases, like the Taliban did in Afghanistan. And the result was that after a period of, shall we say, quiet pacification, when people started to recover their nerve, they began to come back and start attacking the Americans again. Well, the Russians, operating under the philosophy of Klaus von Clausewitz, who was the German theorist of war, who actually served with the Russian army at one time, as I've discussed in many programs, they take a completely different approach. For them, it's not territory that matters, it is destroying, as Clausewitz said, the will of the enemy by defeating and destroying his army. And I'm afraid that's what's happening, and it will continue to happen up to that moment when Ukraine sits down and starts negotiating with the Russians in earnest, moving forward from what happened from the proposals that were made in Istanbul back in March, when the Ukrainians made proposals which seemed to meet the Russian demands halfway. The Russians interpreted it as a sign that the Ukrainians were coming round to negotiating seriously about a settlement of the long-standing conflict in Ukraine, and for a brief period of time the prospects of peace and of a settlement of the war, ending all this death and destruction, looked bright. And instead everything went into reverse, and the person who perhaps bears the greatest responsibility, is Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, who telephoned President Zelensky directly after the meeting in Istanbul between the Ukrainian and Russian negotiators, told President Zelensky, and this he did after he discussed the matters with the Biden administration, told President Zelensky that if Ukraine was considering making any territorial compromises, then Britain and the United States would not give Ukraine the security guarantees that Zelensky needed in order to explain to the Ukrainian people why Ukraine would not be joining NATO. And moreover, Johnson and again the United States promised Ukraine that if Ukraine continued to fight, there would be a vast flood of Western weapons which would pour into Ukraine and would turn the tide of the battle. And a few weeks later, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and he spoke directly with Zelensky, and he repeated all these same points that he'd made to Zelensky over the telephone, and he was followed a short time after that by Secretary Blinken of the United States, Secretary of State Blinken, and Defense Secretary Austin, who also apparently told Zelensky the same thing. So the result was that Ukraine took an absolutist position. They said that after the events in northern Kiev, where the Russian troops had supposedly carried out atrocities, that there was no question of any further negotiations with the Russians. They said that Ukraine would fight on until victory was achieved. They started to pitch their terms of victory with British encouragement at fanciful and impossible levels, saying that they would recapture the whole of Donbass and Crimea as well. And the result is this war, which is now turning into an absolute disaster for Ukraine, in which thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are dying, trying to hold unachievable positions, undefendable positions, and with the Ukrainians now having set their demands for victory at such a high level that one feels that it's going to be very difficult for President Zelensky, for his foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, for Arestovich, his spokesman, for all of these people to turn round now and say that, well, actually, we cannot continue the war in the way that we're doing. We have to return to the Istanbul process, and all those hundreds, thousands of lives that have been lost in the ensuing months were thrown away for nothing. So it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to do that. But that is what they must now, I say, must do. And I'm not the only person now who's saying it. Henry Kissinger said it at the conference at the World Economic Forum in Davos about 2 weeks ago. I understand that Edward Ludwig, whom I had not even been aware was still alive, but apparently he is, and he's the best known strategist apparently. Anyway, I've seen a report that he's briefed the State Department in Washington, telling them the same thing, that this is what Ukraine must do. I haven't heard of Ludwig for a very, very long time, so I'd assumed that he'd left us, but apparently he hasn't. But in any event,
I'm a top-sell freelancer.
Instead of working at one Fortune 500 company,
I have the opportunity to work with lots of them.
And when I'm finished with...
This is a mistaken report. Lots of other people are saying it too. We've had reports from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, from all sorts of people and places, all of them saying the same thing. Ukraine cannot win this war. There will not be enough Western weapons to turn the tide, and in view of this, Ukraine must sit down and negotiate in earnest and bring this war to an end. The terms will no doubt be less favourable than those that might have been achieved in March, but better whatever terms are now proposed by the Russian side than a disaster, a collapse that might come, and of course better that than the throwing away of lives to no useful purpose. I'm going to make just two further observations. The first is that the Russians might still be willing to compromise on certain important issues. Now, yesterday, in my previous video, I discussed, and indeed I quoted extensively from an interview that President Putin gave with Russia 1 television, in which basically he discussed economic issues, the way in which, as far as he was concerned, it was the West that had brought about the crises in energy and food through misconceived economic policies extending back many years, but aggravated by the responses to the pandemic of the last few years, and of course the sanctions. One thing that did strike me about that particular interview is that when he was referring to the conflict in Ukraine, President Putin spoke about the special operation, the Russian military special operation in Ukraine, and then he corrected himself and said Donbass. And then he was very careful in the rest of the interview to speak specifically of Donbass rather than Ukraine as a whole. Now, I think at the beginning it was what we might call a Freudian slip, in the sense that I think that Russia is now thinking definitely beyond Donbass. I mean, we've discussed in previous programs how they've made very clear that they're not pulling back from Kherson region, from Zaporozhye either, and the Ukrainians also seem to think, by the way, that after the Russians have finished their operation in Donbass, Zaporozhye will be their next target, and President Zelensky has now made comments to that effect. He said that the most dangerous point of the battle is for the moment for the Ukrainians, is Zaporozhye, where the regional capital is now under threat. But anyway, even though I suspect the Russians are now thinking beyond Donbass, Putin was very careful to correct himself to talk only of Donbass in this interview. And I think the reason he did that was that he was giving the Ukrainians space to come to the negotiating table, to sit down and to negotiate. So they don't have to go into the negotiating room already acknowledging that other regions of Ukraine are going to be detached from Ukraine as well as Donbass. That's something that the Russians are prepared to work through over the process of negotiations. Now, that's not a concession from Putin, but it does, it seems to me, help the Ukrainians. It does leave the door ajar for negotiations. And of course, he also spoke about how Russia is prepared to help Ukraine reopen its ports, Odessa specifically, if the Ukrainians start taking various steps like demining these ports, raising these ships they sunk in Odessa harbor, those sort of things. He said that the Russians would, in effect, observe a naval ceasefire to allow Ukraine's grain ships to leave Odessa. Again, I don't know whether Putin expects that that's what the Ukrainians are going to do, but it seems to me that again he was saying these sort of things, partly obviously to show that Russia is not responsible for the global food crisis, but also again to emphasize to the Ukrainians, to make it clear to the Ukrainians that the door for negotiations is open. They can discuss the food issue, they can discuss access to the port of Odessa, and of course they can talk about other matters. And it's perhaps worth pointing out at this point that after the Istanbul proposals that the Ukrainians made, the Russians put counter proposals to the Ukrainians. We've never seen them. Ukraine has never responded to them. Zelensky, very foolishly, in my opinion, pretended that they'd never been sent at all, even though they clearly have been. The first step that the Ukrainians need to take is they need to respond formally to those Russian counter proposals. It's probable, it's likely that the Russians will say, well, those counter proposals were made in the context of the negotiation in March in Istanbul. The situation has now changed, and we're going to harden our proposals beyond our counter proposals beyond those that we made following the talks in Istanbul. But at least it provides the Ukrainians an opportunity, a mechanism to resume the talks without appearing to be, dragged